So today's session, I'd like to introduce Neil Crowther. So Neil's on the line already, and we're going to be talking about promoting the wellbeing of people living with dementia. We've been planning this session for a while, so I'm really excited to find it's finally here. So without further ado, Neil, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. My name's Neil Crowther. Just a bit of background for me before I begin, because you might be wondering why would you listen to me in the first place, which is a reasonable question to ask. My professional background is in the field of disability rights, particularly promoting people's right to independent living. So I worked for several years at the Disability Rights Commission and then at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And I've been freelance since 2011, working on projects in the UK, in Europe and internationally, again, generally about independent living. In more recent years, I've been a co-convener of a thing called Social Care Future, which is trying to reimagine the future of social care and push that in a different direction. But against that backdrop, in 2014, my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so that caused me to start joining dots that I didn't feel had been historically joined. And the thing I'm going to talk about this morning is a paper that was published earlier this year by the Dementia Change Action Network, which is me trying to join some of those dots. So I just wanted to share that with you to begin with. So, you don't have to listen to me. These are very much personal reflections allied to my work in the past on disability rights and independent living, on thinking about personalised care. And in writing the paper, I was really trying not just to kind of say something about how we thought about care and support and people with dementia, but social care in the round and how that might be rethought and reappraised when we thought about the well-being of people living with dementia. So I just thought that was some helpful context. And I also wanted to say that I'm going to draw on personal experience. I'm going to tell you things while I talk that for me can be painful to recount. I guess they're less raw now, as I kind of moved. My dad died about just over 2 years ago, so they're less painful to recount than they were, or less raw, although I might kind of wobble, so forgive me in advance if that happens. But I realise that some of you may be going through similar experiences and can find these things upsetting. And I know a lot of us mix our personal with professional experience here. And in any case, we're all human with families and loved ones. So just a bit of a kind of warning in advance. I don't mean I'm going to get really kind of graphic, but I'm going to tell stories that are personal and, you may find upsetting. But I think it's important and valuable that we do share these stories, that we humanise what it is we're talking about, that we don't kind of slip into system speak and become unhuman. I think that's one of the big problems that actually we have when we talk about social care and personalised care. It can all become very mechanical. But I do want to also say one thing that I've been reflecting on a lot recently. I've only my own perspective and the people that I've spoken to draw on. And this is my truth. It's no more valid than anyone else's. So, for example, I was listening to a new podcast last night with the chief executive of the Alzheimer's Society, Kate Lee, who was talking very powerfully about her perspective of her mum's experience of residential care and her experience of that. And I realised listening to it, that isn't something I have an experience of. My dad died before we got really to that point in time. So I just wanted to sort of preface it. This is one perspective. Above all else, I hope that we'll be listening more and more to people who are living with dementia wherever possible, because I know from our work with Social Care Future, and when we start with the insight, priorities and experience of people who draw on support or people who support people who draw on support, we often have a very different conversation than we start within kind of think tank world or professional world. So I think that's really, really crucial. I think it enriches the debate. But a plea, I'm going to share these personal stories, but I've seen what sometimes happens when we do this. It ends up insulating us from any critique or criticism. Okay, but I'm a professional. I work in this space, and my goal in doing this is I want to improve the lives of other people living with dementia now and in the future. And that's only going to happen if I can improve on my thinking on what I've done to date. So the fact I'm sharing personal stories isn't reason for any of you not to say, actually, that was a bit of nonsense, so I didn't quite agree with that. Okay, but I have seen how that happens sometimes, and that's not why I'm doing it. So I just wanted to begin there. I hope that was helpful. But I actually want to turn the conversation to you now, and I want to do an exercise. Actually, oddly, it's the fourth time I've done this week. I rarely do lots of speaking, but this week I've spoken every single day. But it's an exercise that lay behind the development of Social Care Future's vision. And I'm going to give you a word to think about in a second. And I don't want you to think about it deeply at all. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. And all I want you to do is either make a mental note or you can put it in the chat. And I want you to just say what comes to mind, what's top of mind when you hear this word. Or it might be the feelings that it generates, but just words that represent what's in your head. OK, so what I want you to think about is what comes to mind when you think about the place you call home. OK. OK. I'm also terrible because every time I do this, I forget to time it as well. But I think that must be roughly 30 seconds we've had. I don't know how many people on the call. We can either do this with people saying it out, or if Sarah, you want to just give me a flavour first of what people have said.
So there's 31 people on the call.
Okay.
What we've had is from the top. So warmth, family, comfort, happiness, family, warm, safe, family, comfort, family, memories, safety, family, comfortable, family, safe space, safety, comfort, calm, cozy, capacity, happiness, gratitude, family and comfort, warmth, safety, autonomy, privacy, love, safety and comfort, happiness, person-centered, safe, security, love, belonging, safety and love.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm always relieved because this exercise works every time, and we end up covering the same things. I think what's interesting, and there's two things about this exercise in terms of what it's doing. One connects to a lot of the focus of Social Care Future, which is about trying to shift people's imagination about what this is about, and the power of words to do that. Because when we're given a word or given a piece of information, we don't receive it as a blank slate. What our brains do is go in search of stories that we already have. And when we find that story, we say, oh, yeah, and we stop processing. So this is why framing is really important in communications. And I think it's really, really important in how we talk about people living with dementia. I'm not going to spend lots of time on that, but I just wanted to sort of say that. So when we think about home, it sets up all sorts of ideas and feelings. If we'd just done that exercise and asked you to think about personalised care, it would have sent your brains in all sorts of other different directions. But the other thing that I think is important about that exercise is actually the things that we say aren't really about the physical home or the dwelling, if you like, in which we live. They're the things from which we derive our well-being. So if you were to categorise what we've sort of said there, we often talk about home as haven. So themes about safety and security are very, very powerful. We often talk about our families or the people we love. We talk about issues of kind of comfort, autonomy, control, so home as a territorial space. And we also sometimes talk about self-expression, our identity. It's the space in which we are best able to fully express ourselves. And I think it's just really interesting because when we put home front and centre, suddenly what we're thinking about changes quite dramatically. So what comes to our minds when we think about home are the things from which we derive well-being. And I don't think we need extensive research studies or randomized control trials to prove that. Everybody universally knows that. OK, so I want you to hold that in mind as we talk. So that's going to be quite important to what I say later on. Everybody, we all know that our well-being comes from places and things. It comes from our relationships. It comes from having a sense of control over our lives. It comes from having a sense of safety and security. Those are things I don't think we necessarily need to reprove, but I'm going to come back to as I talk. So I've already alluded to this a bit. My motivation to research and write this report was because, having spent about a quarter of a century in various roles and capacities to advance disabled people's right to independent living, I was then confronted with having to support my own family following my dad's diagnosis with dementia. And whilst that experience didn't in any way challenge my view about the fundamental rights he and others with dementia should enjoy, it was clear to me both that thinking had not shaped how care and support for people with dementia was thought about and approached, nor what was available. Moreover, it was as though the work I'd been involved in and not imagined people with dementia to be rights holders or people to whom the right to independent living should be extended. And yet, by complete chance, the same year my dad was diagnosed, I was contacted by somebody called Professor Peter Mittler, whom I'd met many years earlier related to his work on inclusive education. And actually, it turned out he'd been my mum's tutor at Manchester University when she was studying to be a special educational needs teacher. And through his education work, Peter had become heavily involved in work on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And now, many years on, living with dementia himself, he'd made it his mission to get dementia onto the disability rights agenda and disability rights into the dementia agenda. And he introduced me to a woman called Kate Swaffer in Australia, who was then leading Dementia Alliance International. And through them, I came to be in touch with the deep network here in the UK. And then there was a growing movement of self-advocates pursuing human rights and inclusion and eschewing the idea that a dementia diagnosis simply amounted to social death or would justify institutionalisation, or all these themes that had been dominant within disability rights. So I then did a bit of work with Peter and Kate on mapping the articles of the UN Disability Convention against various goals of Dementia Alliance International. And then I guess when I finally did begin to explore research and thinking about care and people living with dementia, I was immediately struck at how, despite this historic disconnection, it really resonated with and offered an opportunity to enrich that wider thinking, as I said at the beginning. So what I've tried to do is to create bridges between these islands of thinking and practice, to help consider the gaps and the weaknesses perhaps of each, and to begin to put forward a way of thinking about and approaching well-being and personalised support that would benefit everyone. And I wrote it to inform wider debates I think we're often not having, but we must, about how we should anticipate ourselves and the people we care about being able to live our lives when we have cause to draw on support, and about the best ways to grow, sustain, or to repair our health and well-being. And then what this means about how we organise and resource things to those ends. And I think that's crucial now because, you know, while the Labour Party talk about a national care service, or while we talk about integrating health and care, or how we pay for care, or even things like personal budgets, we seem always to forget to ask, what is care and support for, and how can we organise it so it supports us to have our best possible life? But I'm going to start just by introducing my dad. And okay, so that's my dad. Not just living with dementia, dancing in a mill shop in Atherton after we'd been buying new shoes. And it's kind of odd that the lyrics of such a daft song can take on some degree of poignancy and time. Where did he come from? Where did he go? Knowing where he came from was crucial to knowing who he was, as it is all of us. But the truth is that whilst dementia changed him, he didn't go anywhere. So much about him is in that few seconds clip. His sense of fun, his enjoyment of company, liking to make his family laugh, his self-consciousness. You see, he kind of looks over to one side because the shop assistant was laughing at him dancing. His love of music. But at that time, he was really confused. He was often incomprehensible to us. He was quite agitated. He was uncooperative. He was, in fairness, and maybe I've got to be careful here, he was a Yorkshireman, and quite a stubborn, bloody-minded Yorkshireman. So maybe this is just a characteristic anyway. But he was still my dad. And there was a powerful piece in the Irish Times. It was written on New Year's Eve in 2019, a woman called Professor Susan Carhill, and she wrote, "All too often we hear dementia referred to as the thief that steals the individual. The person is the patient or the sufferer, a shell of a former self. The family caregiver is the hidden victim, and the increase in the number of people with Alzheimer's disease is a rising tide or tsunami. Words are powerful and influence how we perceive and interact with people. These words do nothing to promote the agency, dignity and humanity of the individual who, no matter how severe their cognitive difficulties, is never gone and is still recognisable as a human being that must be treated with dignity and respect." And my dad was recognisably my dad right up until the final days, hours and seconds of his life. He lived his whole life as David Crowther and he died as David Crowther. And sadly, that was only 6 weeks after this film was taken. His death certificate says that he died of Alzheimer's disease, but it was not actually the cause of death. That was a result of kidney injury. And whilst he died with Alzheimer's disease, I don't believe it was the disease itself that brought his life to an end when it did. What brought his life to an end was the disruption to his and my mum's life, indeed all of our lives, caused by the pandemic. The place he called home became a prison, and he no longer went to familiar places that gave his life meaning, like watching Lee Centurions or Sale Sharks. He didn't see the people that mattered to him, and those he did had no choice but to change their behaviour towards him to protect him from COVID, which he didn't really understand. Strangers arrived and invaded his privacy. He couldn't be and do the things that gave him purpose, or follow the usual routines and rhythms of life, going out for a walk, always involving tea and cake, being a key one. Power ebbed away from him over how he lived his life, not precipitated by his dementia, but by this new context. In sum, the things that held his personhood and his identity came apart, and with it his well-being. He lost interest in eating or getting dressed, drinking fluids or taking his medication. He became agitated and confused, and it became too much for my mum, who had to cope largely alone during the early lockdowns. And I know he and we were not alone in that. An avoidably prolonged hospital admission without visitors saw him deteriorate really shockingly, both mentally and physically. He was discharged to a care home for a few days, at our suggestion, I should add, before being readmitted to hospital with this kidney injury. Thanks to the discretion of the hospital, we were able to be with him for these final 11 days as he died, and I'm really grateful for that. What might I salvage from this story and countless others like it? If I, and I imagine all of you, can name the things that can precipitate such a sharp decline in health and well-being, then it seems to me incontrovertible that all of those things matter hugely when it comes to generating and sustaining all of our health and well-being as well. Indeed, you've already pointed to all of them in the exercise we did at the beginning. And if that's the case, then it seems obvious that finding ways to sustain, repair or grow these things should be the business of truly personalised care and support, and of public policy and practice more widely. And it was talking about this idea that is how I came across Professor Tom Kitwood's work. And many of you on this call will be better schooled in Kitwood's work than me, but what struck me most was that he and others such as Steve Sabat observed and documented how people's experience of dementia seemed dictated not simply by the biological process of the disease, but equally by a person's own psychological response to it, and by the impact of how others behave towards them. He observed that where such behaviours were negative, it undermined people's sense of personhood and led to what he called ill-being. And hence, Kitwood identified the task of sustaining personhood as central to promoting well-being and in turn people's health. Of course, his work focused in particular on people residing in residential and nursing care homes, and so insofar as he considered the impacts of behaviours and how such behaviour could be changed through positive person work, it was largely directed at care staff. And in the paper, I contrast Kitwood's work with that of John O'Brien, a pioneer of person-centred planning for people with learning disabilities, and I note how the language of rights, of community inclusion, and of the centrality of personal agency, choice and control were central to O'Brien's ideas, but it was far less explicit in Kitwood's, perhaps because of where he focused his work. But it's clear that thinking has evolved well beyond that in the intervening years. Indeed, I quote Claire Sir in the report when she says that people with dementia are first and foremost citizens. Their needs should be considered in broader terms than just the provision of care. People need to be included and supported to remain active citizens with control over their lives. When formal and informal care is required, it must meet people's holistic needs, underpinned by the upholding of personhood. And this is the topic of other things that have developed since, the we statements developed by Dementia Alliance International, which frame various dimensions of well-being as human rights. And this links to disability rights. Professor Gerard Quinn, who's now the UN Special Rapporteur on Disability Rights and a co-author of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, has said that the convention that its overriding purpose is to nourish personhood and create the conditions for human flourishing. And he's also been at the forefront of challenging sometimes how we think about personhood and autonomy, encouraging us to think about personhood as being shared and autonomy as being something that's relational. We're not islands, we're interdependent. Our personhood emerges out of our interaction with the world around us, not in despite of it. And in fact, it was a report by Gerard that drew my attention to a beautiful paper by somebody called Hilde Lindemann called Holding Each Other in a Time of Dementia, in which she says, an identity is a representation of a self. It consists of a tissue of stories constructed not only from first person, but also many third person perspectives, depicting the more important acts, experiences, relationships and commitments that characterize a person and allows that person and those around him to make sense of who he is. But crucially, she also argues that it's not just other people that hold us to our identities, but also familiar places and things, beloved objects, pets, cherished rituals, one's own bed or favourite shirt can also help us maintain our sense of self. And she goes on to say, it's no accident that much of this kind of holding goes on in the place where our families are, at home. Our homes are manifest who we are at the same time as they provide the physical scaffolding that supports who we are. They're the solidly familiar axis around which our changing world revolves. And again, you know, you don't need to hear that passage because it's all self-evident to you from the exercise we did at the beginning. That's to say, our personhood's constructed and it's reaffirmed by the worlds we inhabit. And if we're displaced from those worlds, or if they are disrupted or distorted, then we begin to lose our personhood and in turn our well-being. And that's where I saw the thinking of the likes of Tom Kitwood and Hild Lindemann and John O'Brien and Gerard Quinn and people like Mike Oliver, who articulate the social model of disability, begin to come together. And I think they can be fused and adapted in powerful new ways. Contrary to a lot of misunderstanding, the social model of disability isn't in denial about the reality of impairments or health conditions or their impact on people. A great many people who have rights related to disability under the Equality Act, who are the intended beneficiaries of the UN Disability Convention, also access continuing healthcare, use medication, treatments, therapies and rehabilitation in order to live the lives that they live. Rather, like Tom Kitwood's thinking, it simply broadens our understanding of what it is that permits people to live well, framing disability as something that's socially reproduced barriers to participation that are therefore amenable to change. It makes no sense at all to me to preclude people living with dementia from such thinking, given the great many benefits that we know can come from reasonable adjustments, accessible design, supported decision making and personalised support, for example. Indeed, I think it's both morally and legally necessary to address them. And this brings me back to care and support. The point is, care doesn't deliver well-being, but it can undermine it. Effective personalised support respects our rights to control over our lives. It's focused on what matters to us, and it helps us to stay connected with the people, places and things from which our well-being is derived. These things are all expressed in the vision of Social Care Future, which I helped to produce, and which starts, we all want to live in the place we call home, with the people and things that we love, in communities where we look out for one another, doing the things that matter to us. And if this vision of well-being is to be our North Star, then we have to quite radically rethink our goals and how we organise and resource things for the future. For simplicity in the paper, I've broken down this ecosystem that holds personhood and well-being together into places and things, people and relationships, purpose, pattern and routines, and power and agency. Now, I haven't got time to get into the whole detail of the paper today, but I'm going to finish this by expanding on each dimension a little and point to some of the examples of promising practices that I think we could build on. But a fundamental starting point, and I know many of you already subscribe to this already, and it's a simple idea, but the starting point is to ask what matters to you, not what's the matter with you. We need to reframe the conversation pre and post diagnosis, support people to think differently about the life they value and wish to lead, the things that can make that happen now, and what adjustments they might need to carry on doing so. It demands thinking ahead and planning, and that involves a whole heap of tricky psychology in a society that has elevated dementia as one of its biggest fears. Just as with mental health, I think we need to go about challenging stigma about people living with dementia so that it isn't internalized by people with dementia or their families, friends and communities. And again, I don't mean in a way that's in denial about the realities of the disease or its impacts on people, but one that gives people a sense of hope and possibility of change, of living as well as possible, of living their best life. So starting here with so-called strength-based conversations, I think we can stop thinking about care simply as a transactional service delivered to people and instead begin to imagine a different tapestry or mosaic of services, support, relationships, technologies, and new ways of being and doing all coming together. So for example, I was talking to people earlier this week about how, and this is from personal experience, how it was very difficult to kind of imagine a time and task flying visit home care ever being of use to my mum and dad, because the idea that things could simply be fitted into time slots didn't work. Personal assistance, on the other hand, could be a real model, could be really powerful. We might have to think beyond the idea of direct payments, but the philosophy of personal assistance oriented around a person's life, really I could think would be life-changing. But it's quite obvious there are systemic problems that often deny personal assistance or access to personal assistance. to people with dementia. One being the low expectations or the assumptions made by some local authorities that it's just not suitable. I think shared lives is another model that is really underexplored as well. So I think these kind of models, core models of care, I think we can radically kind of move away. I see too often a kind of binary in the narrative between informal carers struggling away and then suddenly faced with the choice of somebody having to move into a care home. I thought that was very much in the story that BBC News has been covering over the last couple of months of Bill and his wife, Sue, I think her name is, and the stories that have been told there, where clearly he was finding no community-based support or real valuable support from home care. And actually, in the end, the home care agency sort of fell apart and didn't have any support to offer. I think new and emerging technology has a huge role to play, and this need not necessarily be so-called care technology. Many people, including people living with dementia, are already drawing on and repurposing readily available technologies such as Amazon's Alexa, tablets, smart home systems such as Hive, geo-tracking built into smartphones and smartwatches, monitoring for falls and biometric data, telemedicine and teleconferencing. As these and other emerging technologies become more connected, they offer the opportunity to empower more people living with dementia to live independently in the community and for family carers to enjoy more independence as well and peace of mind. However, there are few places for people with dementia and their families to find out about or share tips or recommendations about technology or how it might be used or to try technology out with support. I think we need to take a leaf out of what's happened in terms of people with learning disabilities and place restrictions on the scale of congregate care settings. It's really very, very strange that amongst residential and nursing care, what we're seeing is a trend towards ever larger congregate care settings when we profess to have moved away from models of institutional care and place a limit on the size and scale of newly registered congregate care settings for people with learning disabilities. And really, if there is one lesson from COVID-19, we know what the evidence is in terms of the risks that are prevalent in large settings of such kind, not just in terms of health, but in terms of people's personhood and their well-being. And I think we should be thinking about that. I think we have to move away just from this idea of person-centered support, and I think we need to think much more about relationship-centered support. How, you know, if we're thinking about personhood and the idea of it being shared and how we all mentioned our families and our relationships, how do we factor that into the way we think about what matters to the person and to their well-being, rather than subvert and perverse family relationships, particularly putting so much pressure on unpaid family carers, which can be hugely destructive to everyone involved. I'd like to see peer support get supercharged. It's been great seeing the 10th anniversary of the Dementia Voice network. I think that can grow out and develop even further. And just talking to people involved about the sense of affiliation, of possibility and purpose it gives them, it's just hugely valuable and I think needs more investment. My family benefited from a community circle, which was hugely powerful in supporting my mum and dad to carry on living the life that mattered to them. Right up until March 2020, really, my dad was still managing to get to the rugby. My mum was managing to get to the choir because friends were helping and supporting. I think thinking about how we bring community together, how community can be reorganised to support people, but to do that intentionally is really powerful. Obviously, we talk about social prescribing. I think that's important, but I think it needs amending a bit to kind of work in this way. Other models like local area coordination, I think, could be really powerful for people living with dementia. And I think I'd like to see us move a bit from dementia-friendly communities to a broader idea of inclusive communities. I mentioned I work for the Disability Rights Commission and the EHRC. There hasn't been, as far as I know, a single case under the Disability Discrimination Act or the Equality Act concerning access to goods and services for people with dementia and reasonable adjustments. And that's pretty frankly inexplicable. So I think we need to supercharge that and think, how do we genuinely build equitable, accessible, inclusive communities for people? So much we can do with the resources we already have, but what we really need to do is shift imagination and expectation. It's to build the power and voice of people living with dementia. I'd like to see far more co-production in the way we design policies and services and so on. And I think I would like to see us support and take bets on transformative innovation. I'm rather worried about the increased dominance of health in some of these debates. and that some of the initiatives I've talked about, like community circles, would just not survive the kind of randomised control trials that the NHS or health sector might demand. I think we need to really be thinking about health and well-being in a much broader sense than we are doing to make this change happen. So just to conclude, so I've gone on a little bit, one person who commented on an earlier draft of the report suggested that to frame dementia as disability rather than disease was an old way to think about it and devoid of the hope that we might soon find a cure. And I saw yesterday there's the latest news about some potential drug that might be available next year. But read between the lines and it's quite clear that its potential is relatively limited, even if it's a first step on that journey. Now, someday a cure for dementia may turn up and many pin their hopes on that. But irrespective of that, people living with dementia today are part of human diversity and they have a right to be in the world as full citizens leading their best lives. And another person who reviewed a draft of the report was Dame Philippa Russell, who some of you may know, who again spent much of her life in the field of supporting the rights of disabled children. She had a disabled child herself, now an adult, supporting adults with learning disabilities. But in recent years has supported both her husband and relatives as they've experienced dementia. And she said, "My son, brain damage, learning disabilities, is 58. He has his own home, he's a talented artist, he has friends and is known and liked in his local community. But when he was born and for many years, we endured offers of places in long stay hospitals, negative attitudes, low expectations, discrimination and exclusion. Attitudes and expectations towards people with learning disabilities changed out of all recognition in his lifetime. Can we do the same for dementia?" Thank you.
That was amazing, Neil. Thank you so much for sharing that. Gosh, it's really powerful. You know, the fact that you said we needed to take a minute at the beginning, and yeah, it does create really powerful emotions, doesn't it? Does anybody have any questions or even just comments about what you heard from Neil?
So I was gonna. I'm usually told off because I'm always the big mouth here. But I think from what I've been listening to, so I'm new to this sector of healthcare. I come from a learning disabilities background, so I've noticed that when I'm going into meeting family and meeting the people that we're supporting, that a lot of I thought I was going to be quite disadvantaged going into this environment because I don't have any of that kind of clinical kind of hands-on approach to personal care and kind of like the nuts and bolts of domiciliary care. And I found that actually my background in learning disabilities has been really quite useful because there's a lot of crossover. So, you know, I kind of put in about capacity and person-centered approach because I think sometimes the clinical side of things, the fact the practicalities of what dementia brings people in terms of, you know, protecting their dignity and making sure they're comfortable physically. I think sometimes the kind of holistic approach and the well-being of that individual mentally gets kind of lost in it, and I find it quite frustrating because there's a lot of crossover. So a lot of things we do with the people I supported with learning disabilities, which was kind of a lot of emotional support, not just for the individual but for families. I think families are faced with all sorts of terrible scenarios and situations, just kind of watching their loved one deteriorate and not having the support in place. I found it quite challenging, really. So hearing Neil's story, there's a lot of things in there which, you know, I kind of say I think I'm a fresh pair of eyes in my organisation, seeing things, and I'd like to try and, you know, and I've already made some headway in supporting families and things like that. But it was kind of reassuring to know that, and that's not just me. I'm not kind of got the wrong end of the stick. It's kind of, yeah, other people see that as well. So yeah, I found it really useful. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. That was lovely. Nikki, you've put in the chat, and this was something that struck me about that low expectations bit. Do you want to expand on that?
In the spot.
Yes,
It was
sorry.
just,
Yes, come on, Nikki.
no, it did strike me straight away just about the low expectations of people that are creating the service and sort of putting it, but then also low expectations the person, what you said about relating to learning disabilities, you know, for the people with dementia, it's yeah, it's just given me a few things to reflect about, really, and it has made me, I can identify several times where that is the case, isn't it? And it's just, and I like when we're looking at needs and looking at supporting people, it seems to be the basics, really. Yeah.
Neil, do you think that would change if we develop more about, you know, the storyboard work, where actually people know the person, the life story work? Because often people see the dementia, don't they, and they've stopped thinking about that person that is parent, did have a job, or and how the things that they enjoy, the things that they were good at, and they see only deficits. They don't see any assets to that person anymore. And is there something, I suppose what I was thought was, how do we change some of these attitudes? How can we practically now change some of those attitudes around people living with dementia ourselves as individuals? What can we do as individuals practically on a day-to-day basis to change it and to change that low expectation?
We get that from families as well. Sorry, we do get that from families, don't we? There's low expectations of the family that then results in low mood and frustration. Sorry, Neil.
No, it's fine. I think, well, it's interesting, isn't it? You say that because if you look at the Time to Change campaign, which was around mental health stigma, which has been pretty successful in shifting the debate there. What they found very early on is when they talked to people with mental health or mental ill health about where they felt they experienced stigma or prejudice, the main people they identified was family, friends and colleagues. It wasn't strangers. And so that whole campaign focused there. It was actually trying to change the relationships people had with the immediate people around them. And I think the same goes here too. You know, I remember when my dad was diagnosed really very early on. It was barely discernible. There was obviously something not right, but, you know, at first, and that whole process was awful. At first, it was like mild cognitive impairment. I remember mum and dad were sort of celebrating it wasn't Alzheimer's without even thinking what mild cognitive impairment was. Nobody really explained any of this. And then suddenly it changed and it was actually Alzheimer's. The whole process was really awful. My dad was quite stoic about it. He was just thinking, well, until it's really affecting me, I'll just kind of carry on. And I think my mum, in honesty, was just grieving almost immediately. And I remember, I will tell you this story, but I remember coming home from seeing the psychiatrist, it must have been. And I think the first thing my mum started to ask my dad about was his funeral plans. And I was like, whoa, this is a bit premature. But I think that's a lot of people's mindset. I think dementia is presented as living death. And I think that's how it's understood. So I think there's a huge amount of stigma about the whole thing out there. And of course, it's a journey and things change over time. But there are clearly hundreds of thousands of people out there who have dementia, who are living in the community, who have the potential to live full lives and do lots and lots of kind of things, who are unable to because of stigma and discrimination and barriers and everything else. And I think that's where it begins. So I think we have to change the story is one part. I think the other is this structural thing which Social Care Future focuses a lot on, which is about sharing power and the degree to which people with dementia are themselves sat in discussions like this, talking about their experiences and their aspirations. And simply that act shifts how we think and how we talk and how we regard things. So, and I think that's something we can all do and just do in the way we operate. And then lastly, just one quick thing, because I think it is hard to shift kind of ingrained kind of attitudes in the health system, the social care system, particularly at a time of scarcity. And this isn't about my dad. I don't think my mum would mind me saying, but last winter she became very unwell. She was having what at first we thought was a series of TIAs, but it turned out to be hemiplegic migraines. Okay, and I think it was a delayed reaction. It was grief really coming back. And the reality is she kept falling and she kept injuring herself and she kept having to go to hospital. But the reason she was falling and injuring herself is because she was sad. Not any other thing. Nothing you could sort of just say some base physiological need. She was falling over because she was depressed and she was lonely. My dad was not drinking water or taking his medications because he was depressed and his well-being and his sense of personhood had been undermined. So no matter what you could throw at somebody in terms of saying we have delivered medication, we have got somebody in to get you dressed, it wouldn't have worked. So I think we've got to get away from this idea that there's this sort of baseline physiological need and then well-being is some sort of desirable thing on top of it. I think we have to think about human motivation all the time, which is why I would like us, I mean, this is part of a broader shift. Can we move away from the NHS as a treatment system and care as just looking after people to something that is much more broadly about what shapes our health and well-being? And I realise that sounds incredibly ambitious, but, you know, I think we all know it's what we're doing isn't enough. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Totally agree, Neil. And we talk about this biophysiological psychological social model, and actually for older people it isn't just in long-term conditions one bit of it, and how it manifests and what you need to address is across the whole piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are there any comments on what Neil just said? Because I'm just going to agitate slightly around that thought. I know that your mum probably didn't pick a time around advanced care planning, the posh word for asking whether he was what his funeral plans were.
Oh yeah, sorry.
But there is something around empowering people and you know, the whole death thing we're really, really frightened of, aren't we? And when you work with palliative care colleagues, it's demystifying some of this thing that will happen to us, all of us, and removing some of the fear and enabling people to talk about it. But there is a time, and what's fact people find really hard is when is the right time, isn't it? So I just had that little thought there. Has anybody else got any thoughts on any of those things that Neil just said? We're all a bit stunned and quiet today, aren't we? Is there anything in the chat box?
There's quite a bit going on in the chat.
Yeah.
So I can't see the chat, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
I have to relay to it. But I want to remind you what I said at the start. Just because I told this story and it's a bit sad, doesn't mean I don't want to be challenged.
No.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So yeah, because that is true. That is true. Sometimes it is hard to challenge somebody with a really powerful emotion and story. I really like your thoughts, Kate, here, thinking back to that empowerment bit and a bit about so Kate Palmer, you've put in about something around LD nursing, and that resonates really with me because I cover learning disabilities in one of my roles as well, and how we really haven't learned some really great stuff from the people who lead in learning disabilities. Did you want to come in there, Kate?
I have, my best friend is a learning disabilities nurse. My background's palliative and now dementia, but that threads through everything. I mean, I'm just finding this fascinating. I learn a lot from families, actually, how they, I'm humbled by how they, and that's where I often take my lead from. But I also struggle with some families that I know could be doing the personhood better. And how do you change that? You know, so it's such a big thing, isn't it? Societal change, and we all need. And I think it's shifted in recent years because it's had to, because of resources that we, you know, I was a bit skeptical about the community, you know, peer support and all things, but there's been some such, you know, you've quoted a lot of really positive, good results, and you know, it's pockets, it's maybe local, it depends on the people doing it, you know, but it's getting there. I think, you know, it gives me hope. Thank you. Yeah, and I think, but it is going to take massive change. You know, the care, my big thing is the carers, you know, so under-resourced, so under-trained, so that they could be brilliant, and they're not, they're just chucked in. You know, you talk about it, that, you know, the packages of care, and they could be so different, couldn't they? They could be so different. And utilised so differently. Thank you. I think that's
Thank you.
Should have said actually, we were supported once my dad was in hospital by an Admiral nurse who was amazing, and what was really interesting is how care isn't uniform culturally or values wise. And actually, some of the most beautiful care we saw was palliative care. It was care right at the end of my dad's life. And the contrast between that and experience he had a year earlier in a stroke ward, which was just awful, was just remarkable. So we talk about joined up health and social care, but the NHS is not joined up at all, is it?
No.
Internally, even one hospital can be just radically different between different wards in terms of philosophy and practice and so on. But I just wanted to make that point about palliative care as well. I genuinely think a lot of this, ageism as well, is really our kind of unspoken fear of dying. And I think actually we talk more about dying, death, we might hope to change attitudes to all sorts of other kind of things about aging and what it means to kind of live well as you get older, and that, you know, dying well is living well rather than the opposite. You know, I think there's breakthroughs we could have there.
Yeah, and it's amazing that Dying Matters Week is usually just before Dementia Action Week, and but yeah, we get a very different, you know, turnout to presentations and things. It is interesting that we're very compassionate towards the end of life, and we see that as a time when we should be compassionate, but yet we don't use some of those compassionate communities at the same time during somebody's life. I was interested, Kate, you said something about peer support, and I just wondered, Sheila, I know you put something in the chat box about it, and I just thought it might be great to just share your experience, because there's some really great peer support stuff going on. Sheila, did you want to come in? I might put her on the spot now.
We've got a hand up anyway.
I think Sheila's just left.
Oh, she's just left. Oh, I waited too long. So they've got some great peer support work in North Yorkshire. Okay, so let's go to
as well, Sarah, we have as well working with innovations.
Brilliant. Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, well, we've basically working with innovations in dementia, and we deliver the Good Life with Dementia course. So that's embedded in all of our memory assessment services, that you automatically get referred to the Good Life with Dementia course post-diagnosis. And then the spin-off of that is our East Riders. So that's our group of people living with dementia who meet on a regular basis to support each other, to support their carers, their loved ones. And it's had such a phenomenal reaction to it. It's growing in strength. We're opening more groups across the East Riding. It's been fantastic, but it's such a powerful thing to have that peer support, to just normalise and to be able to just have. I think the loveliest one was when they first met after COVID as a real group in a real meeting on the beach, and the feedback was we were just a normal group of people meeting to walk our dogs. It felt like the first time that they'd been able to just have a normal conversation since they'd had a diagnosis, and that just resonated massively with all of us. So yeah, we're very, very passionate about it over here in Hull and East Riding, very passionate about how we shape our services using their input for the future. It's so important that we don't just create a service that we think looks good.
Thank you, Alison. And I know in some work we've done recently, we used their voice instead of just saying, because I think it can be very tokenistic just to have somebody living with dementia on a group, but actually it's how do you get meaningful input and really allow them a say. So we did some of that work, didn't we, recently, Alison? I can see a few more hands up. Sally Ann, did you want to come in? Because I'm just conscious as we slip towards the hour. Sally Ann, what did you want to say?
I just wanted to say, so I'm a social worker in one of the locality adult social work teams based at Morthorpe, and I don't know if you're all aware, but we're going through a restructure at the moment. So I just wanted to feed in really that at the moment the locality teams we're working covers, so as a social worker I will cover people with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, mental health, and older people with dementia. But the restructure is actually going to be, we're going back to more specialisms, more specialised teams. So I just wanted to emphasise really that I think that it's going to be a really good thing, because when you're looking at care packages and new staff coming in and getting used to, you know, actually working with a client group, I've been around for like 20 odd years or so, and I really do think you get that more personalised care if you know that service area that you're working in. So I just wanted to feed that into yourselves really, and just say thank you for a great session as well. I mean, you know, very powerful, you know, story at the live story at the beginning from Neil. So yeah, that's my comments from the session.
Well, thank you very much, Sally Ann. That is amazing. There was a hand up from Robert earlier,
Robert,
and he's put it down again. And I know you had a problem with your sound earlier. Did you want to come in there, Robert?
Yeah, I'm just conscious of the fact of the time. I didn't want to keep anybody back. I was just thinking, you know, just on the back end of the conversation about.
Oh,
Robert,
you've gone on mute.
Just lost your sound.
Try again.
think it's my microphone. I'll just keep very, very still. Just on the back end of the conversation about peer support, and probably one of the greatest lessons I've learned during the pandemic, which kind of through everything that I was doing and my team were doing. We were a day service meeting up in a building. We just couldn't make it safe. It was, you know, it was a small building. So we had to kind of react very quickly. And part of that was going out into the community and doing sessions and activities to occupy time, meaningful activities. We suddenly switched it out into the community, and there was a lot of anxiety associated, you know, the people are going to be alongside members of the public. Oh no, what are we going to do? And it turned out to be an absolute fantastic outcome, because we were doing a couple of things. First of all, they were leading their best lives ever, and they were doing things which we had underestimated and thought they could never do. So we kind of underestimated their capabilities, getting on buses, catching trains, working alongside normal people, and going to the gym, and all of a sudden we weren't running disability only sessions. They were going to the allotment gardens along with, you know, retired people, and there was that kind of crossover between generations, and we felt that we were educating the local community on learning disabilities and on disability as a whole, not, you know, not just learning disabilities but physical disability. And out of that kind of adversity of the pandemic came loads of opportunities, and it's something I would like to bring to the organisation in now, is the fact that the other thing as well is that a lot of the people we employ who are kind of delivering the service had so many ideas when it came to kind of problem solving this. We were all sat with senior leaders and discussing it, and we didn't have a clue. As soon as we started involving the staff who were there delivering the service, things changed. You know, they had all the solutions, they had all the great ideas, and I witnessed it yesterday. I went to go and meet a family member whose wife has got progressive, I forget if I might get the pronunciation wrong, it's progressive aphasia, and they were doing her nails with she hadn't used it for years. She had a nail thing that she puts the infrared light on and stuff like that. And they're obviously, the ladies who were supporting were keen on their nails, and they'd done hers and she absolutely loved it. And they got a foot spa. And then they were advising the husband on kind of some sensory things that she could do. And I just thought, you know what, I've not trained. That's taught me. I had never even crossed my mind. So I think sometimes it's really important to make sure that we get the staff teams involved in kind of care, in the decision making and in the planning, because too often this is done kind of above them, and they're the ones with all the solutions.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Well said.
I'm just conscious of the time. Neil, you mentioned Dementia Change Action Network.
Mm-hmm.
Is this anything that as individuals that it would help if we were involved in, follow on Twitter? I'm going to put the Twitter handle in. Is there any advice there? Just think about how can we be in action for change as a group of people?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't work for them. I did the paper for them. Ian McCreath leads it. It's NHS England funded, and it was part of the Alzheimer's Society, but it's now located with Think Local Act Personal, which is sort of under the umbrella of the Social Care Institute for Excellence. And it really is it's a network, really. It's not kind of a fixed thing. It is about sharing ideas and exchanging ideas and so on. And I think it's probably, as with a number of things, was a wee bit dormant during COVID and is now sort of trying to recalibrate with a new strategy. But yeah, I think become part of that, because it's an opportunity. You know, I've been to a number of big events with a really interesting mix of people there, people living with dementia, peer groups, NHS England people, practitioners, all kind of sharing ideas and so on. It was really to deliver the universal personalised care stuff from NHS England. That was its original format, but I think it's hoping to sort of branch out from there. So I'll do that. Could I just say one last thing? And I'm not picking up on what Robert just sort of said, but I think this is that the kind of risk with the sort of social prescribing kind of stuff and the kind of language we use in this field. We talk about meaningful activities. I really want people to just be able to do meaningless activities if they want, and be supported to those. You know, the things none of us use this language in our own kind of lives. And, you know, ambling along without purpose, if it makes you feel good, that's great. So let's think about that too. And then the other thing, a colleague just there was talking about the advantage in you know, suddenly having a specialist dementia sort of thing. Of course, there is knowledge and specific knowledge that's about dementia, but fundamentally, the way to support my dad was not to be an expert in dementia, it was to be an expert in David And I think that's the other thing as well, is kind of we've got to stop elevating the condition, although it completely dictates somebody's kind of life journey and how they're going to experience it. If we really mean and we're committed to personalised care and support. Neither of those comments were critical, by the way. I just wanted to throw those challenges in. That's
brilliant. Conscious we're in our last minute. Can you put access to your paper in the chat, though you don't have access? So I'm going to ask Colin to do that.
Yeah.
I've also put the Dementia Change Action Network address if people are interested in having a look at that, and the Twitter handle in the chat box. Thank you, Neil. I think you started the day off in a really thought-provoking way. And I think sometimes we have conversations that are very clinical, and actually this has brought us back down to really grounded about who it is that we are trying to support. And I think that would be useful. There will be a recording of this, and I know that I'm thinking already I'm gonna use some of that recording probably with the Bradford lot, because I want to change people's thoughts and try and empower them, and you're going to do that, or inviting you to come and do that is probably going to be more important than me just doing it. So thank you very much.
Just going to say, Sarah, just quickly, we it's not ready yet. It should be ready in the next week. We've done an animation, a short animation of the paper, which is something that's a bit more kind of shareable and accessible. So that should be available. I don't know when they'll launch it. Available soon as well. Yeah.
So thank you everybody for joining. As always, people are great at contributing, and I really value it. Conversation is, we've got one planned for March around brain health. Thank you very much, Neil. That was amazing. Have a great morning, everybody. And I'll see you next time.